During the divorce trial over asset division, my daughter-in-law's family mocked my son, but when the judge saw me walk in, he froze and said, "Chief Justice Joyce Ann, what are you doing here?" The courtroom went silent as my daughter-in-law and her arrogant family stared at each other in pure panic. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I adjusted my simple navy cardigan as I walked through the marble halls of the courthouse, my sensible shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. At 69, I had learned to dress for comfort rather than impression, though today I wished I had chosen something that might command more respect. The divorce proceedings for my son Elliot were scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and my stomach churned with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today Gaia would finally show some decency, some acknowledgement that we were family. However fractured, I was wrong. The moment I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom C, I felt the chill. Gaia sat at the plaintiff's table, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the fluorescent light, her designer suit probably costing more than my monthly Social Security check. Beside her sat her mother, Helena, a woman who had made it clear from day one that I was beneath their family's standards. But it was the whispered conversation that stopped me cold. "Look what the cat dragged in," Helena murmured to Gaia, not bothering to lower her voice. "I told you she'd show up. Some people have no sense of when they're not wanted." Gaia's laugh was soft but cutting. "Mother, please. She probably doesn't even understand what's happening here. These legal proceedings are far too complex for someone like her." My hands trembled slightly as I found a seat in the gallery, 3 rows behind them. Someone like her. The words echoed in my mind, each syllable a fresh wound. After 32 years of watching Gaia systematically destroy my relationship with my only child, I shouldn't have been surprised. But somehow, I still was. Helena turned in her seat, making a show of looking me up and down. "Gaia, darling, did you see those shoes? Payless, I'm sure. And that handbag looks like it came from a thrift store." "Mother, keep your voice down," Gaia whispered, but she was smiling. "Though you're not wrong. I've been trying to get Elliot to understand for years that his mother simply doesn't fit into our world. Look at her. She looks like someone's cleaning lady." The words hit me like physical blows. I smoothed my cardigan again, suddenly aware of every worn thread, every small stain I hadn't been able to remove. My purse, a practical brown leather bag I'd owned for 15 years, felt heavy on my lap. They were right about everything, technically. I did shop at discount stores. I did buy my clothes secondhand when I could find nice pieces. My pension from my years of public service wasn't generous. But I was here for Elliot. My son, who hadn't called me in 8 months, who had made it clear through his silence that I was no longer welcome in his life. Still, when I heard about the divorce proceedings, something inside me hoped he might need his mother, that maybe, just maybe, the crisis would bring him back to me. Elliot's lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, approached Gaia's table. I watched as Helena gestured in my direction, and all 3 of them turned to stare. The lawyer's expression shifted from polite interest to something approaching disdain. "Mrs. Morrison," he addressed Gaia using her maiden name, which she'd returned to. "I assume that's the mother-in-law you mentioned? The one who's been problematic?" Gaia nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid so, Mr. Peterson. She's never accepted that Elliot and I were building a life together. Always interfering. Always trying to drag him back to her level. It's been one of the major strains on our marriage." My breath caught in my throat. Interfering? I had bent over backwards to stay out of their lives. I had accepted every canceled dinner, every excluded holiday, every excuse about why I couldn't see my grandchildren. How was that interfering? "Well, Mr. Peterson said, adjusting his glasses, "hopefully she won't cause any disruptions today. These proceedings are complicated enough without family drama." The 3 of them shared a look of understanding, as if I were some kind of unpredictable element that might explode at any moment. I wanted to stand up, to defend myself, to tell them that I had never once caused a scene or made demands. but my voice seemed trapped in my throat, weighted down by years of being told I didn't matter. The courthouse doors opened again, and Elliot walked in with his lawyer. My heart clenched at the sight of my son. He looked tired, older than his 34 years, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. When our eyes met across the room, I offered a small, hopeful smile. He looked away immediately. "Elliot, honey," Gaia called softly, patting the seat beside her. "Come sit with us before the judge arrives. We need to discuss strategy." As Elliot approached their table, Helena leaned over to whisper something in his ear. I saw his shoulders tense, and he glanced back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Embarrassment? Shame? Or was it just the same indifference he'd shown me for years? "I think it's best if everyone keeps this civil," Elliot said quietly, though his words seemed directed at me rather than his soon-to-be ex-wife's family. "This is already difficult enough." The message was clear. "Don't make waves, Mother. Don't embarrass me further." I clasped my hands in my lap, feeling smaller than I had in years. Around me, the courtroom began to fill with other people's drama, other people's broken families, but none of their stories felt as lonely as mine. Mr. Peterson shuffled through his papers dramatically. "Your Honor," he said to the empty judge's bench, practicing his opening. "My client has endured years of harassment from her husband's family, particularly his mother, who has consistently undermined their marriage through manipulation and emotional blackmail." The words were rehearsed, polished, and completely false. But who would believe me? Who would look at well-dressed, articulate Gaia and her refined family, then look at me in my discount store clothes and think I was the one telling the truth? Helena turned around one more time, studying me with the kind of cold calculation I'd seen her use when evaluating art at auction houses. "Gaia, dear," she said just loudly enough for me to hear, "I really don't understand what Elliot was thinking all these years. The difference in breeding is so obvious. It's no wonder the marriage failed with that kind of influence." Breeding. As if I were livestock to be evaluated and found wanting. But as I sat there, absorbing their cruelty like a sponge, I held on to one small comfort. They had no idea who they were talking to. None of them had bothered to ask about my life, my career, my accomplishments. To them, I was just Elliot's embarrassing mother, a woman to be tolerated at best and humiliated at worst. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison." As I stood with the rest of the room, I caught Gaia smirking at something her mother whispered. Whatever happened next, I knew this moment would stay with me forever. The moment I realized that some bridges burn themselves, and sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. As Judge Harrison settled into his chair and began organizing his papers, my mind drifted back to the beginning. To the day Elliot first brought Gaia home, 7 years ago, his face glowing with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen since he was a child. "Mom, I want you to meet someone special," he had said, practically bouncing on his heels as he introduced the elegant woman beside him. Gaia had smiled politely, extended a perfectly manicured hand, and said all the right words. But her eyes had swept over my small apartment with barely concealed judgment, taking in the second-hand furniture and outdated kitchen appliances with the precision of an appraiser. That first dinner had been awkward, but not hostile. I had cooked Elliot's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, and Gaia had picked at it delicately while making conversation about her family's import business and their recent trip to Europe. I had tried to contribute to the conversation, mentioning places I'd traveled during my working years, but somehow my stories never seemed to match the sophistication of theirs. "Mom," Elliot had said later, as I walked them to the door, "Gaia and I are getting serious. I hope you two can become close." I had wanted that too, desperately, but the closeness never came. Instead, there was a gradual, systematic erosion of my place in my son's life that was so subtle, so carefully orchestrated, that by the time I understood what was happening, it was too late to fight it. It started with small things. Dinner plans that got moved to restaurants I couldn't afford, then moved again to private clubs where I wouldn't be comfortable. Holiday celebrations that shifted from my apartment to Gaia's family estate, where I felt like a servant who had wandered into the wrong room. "Mrs. Morrison," Helena had said during my first Christmas at their house, "you look lost. The kitchen is through that door if you'd like to help the staff. I'm sure you'd be more comfortable there." I had stood in the doorway of their massive living room, watching my son laugh with Gaia's brothers about golf games and business deals I couldn't understand, feeling like a stranger at my own child's celebration. The kitchen comment had stung, but not as much as seeing Elliot not defend me, not even seem to notice the slight. The engagement party was where things became crystal clear. Gaia had wanted something intimate and elegant, which meant 75 of their closest friends and business associates in the ballroom of the country club. I had worn my best dress, navy blue with small pearl buttons that I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and arrived exactly on time. "Oh," Gaia had said when she saw me, her smile freezing in place. "Mrs. Morrison, you came, not, 'I'm so glad you're here,' or 'Thank you for coming.' Just acknowledgement of my unwelcome presence." I had found a small table in the corner and watched as Gaia introduced Elliot to person after person, spinning stories about their courtship and future plans. Stories that never included any mention of his family, his background, or the woman who had raised him alone from the age of 12. "She's lovely," I heard one woman say to Helena. "Where did she find him?" "Oh, he's completely self-made," Helena had replied smoothly. "Started from nothing, really. Quite an inspiring story of personal transformation. Started from nothing." As if the 18 years I'd spent raising him, the sacrifices I'd made, the love I'd poured into shaping him into the man he'd become, as if none of that counted. As if he had simply materialized at 25, fully formed and ready to join their world. But the real turning point came 6 months later, at the wedding planning dinner. Gaia had invited me to participate in choosing the menu, and I had been so grateful to be included that I ignored the warning signs. The restaurant was far fancier than anywhere I usually went, and I had studied the menu carefully, trying to find something reasonably priced. "Mrs. Morrison," Gaia had said sweetly, "I hope you don't mind, but we've already pre-ordered for the table. I know how overwhelming these menus can be for people who aren't used to fine dining." The assumption burned. The casual dismissal of my ability to navigate a restaurant menu, as if I were some sheltered country woman who had never seen the world. But I had said nothing, just smiled and nodded like the good, accommodating mother I was supposed to be. Then came the conversation about wedding contributions. Traditionally, Helena had explained, the bride's family handles most of the expenses, but it's customary for the groom's family to contribute as well. Nothing too substantial, of course. We understand everyone's circumstances are different. They were asking for $15,000. $15,000 for flowers and music and photography that would commemorate a day where I was clearly an unwelcome guest. My entire savings account contained less than $8,000. "I'll need to think about it," I had said quietly, and the temperature at the table had dropped 10 degrees. "Of course," Gaia had replied, but her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "Take all the time you need." After that dinner, the phone calls from Elliot became less frequent. The dinner invitations stopped entirely. When I called him, Gaia would often answer and explain that he was busy, stressed about work, dealing with wedding planning pressures. She was always polite, always reasonable, but somehow I always ended up feeling like I was being intrusive just by wanting to speak to my own son. The wedding itself was beautiful and painful in equal measure. I sat in the third row, wearing a dress I'd found at a consignment shop, watching my son marry a woman who had methodically erased me from his life. During the reception, I was seated at a table with elderly relatives from Gaia's side, people who spoke to me politely but briefly before turning to more interesting conversations with each other. "Mrs. Morrison," the photographer had said, appearing at my table during the cake cutting, "we're doing family photos now. Would you mind stepping out of the frame for a moment? We want to get some shots of just the immediate family." I had moved aside and watched as they posed Elliot with Gaia's parents, with her siblings, with various combinations of their extended family. Someone took a single photo of Elliot and me together, and that was the only evidence I appeared in that I had been there at all. But the real devastation came later, during what should have been the happiest moment. As Elliot and Gaia prepared to leave for their honeymoon, I approached to say goodbye, to hug my son and wish them well. "Mom," Elliot had said, his voice strained, "I think it's better if we keep some distance for a while. This whole process has been really stressful, and Gaia needs time to adjust to married life without feeling like she's being watched, as if my love for him was surveillance, as if wanting to be part of his life was some kind of violation. I just want you to be happy," I had whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "I know," he had said, but he hadn't hugged me back when I reached for him. "We'll figure things out later." Later never came. The distance became permanent. The occasional phone calls became text messages, then holiday cards, then nothing at all. I learned about my grandchildren's births through mutual acquaintances. I learned about Elliot's promotion at work through the local newspaper's business section. I learned about the problems in his marriage through rumors and whispered conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear. And through it all, I had told myself that this was temporary. That eventually, Elliot would remember who had been there for him through everything. That love would find a way back. But sitting in that courtroom, listening to Gaia's family discuss me like I was some kind of embarrassing mistake, I realized the truth I had been avoiding for years. Gaia hadn't just won my son's heart. She had systematically, deliberately, and completely erased me from his life. And Elliot had let her do it. The bailiff called for order as Judge Harrison prepared to speak, and I forced myself back to the present moment. Whatever happened next, I was done being invisible. I was done being dismissed. I was done letting them pretend I didn't matter. They had no idea what was coming. Judge Harrison looked up from his papers, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he surveyed the courtroom. He was a man in his early 50s, with graying temples and the kind of measured demeanor that came from years of handling family disputes. I had seen him work before, though from a very different perspective, and I knew him to be fair, but no nonsense. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "We're here today for the divorce proceedings of Elliot Morrison versus Gaia Morrison, case number." He paused, looking down at his docket, then glanced up again, his eyes scanning the room in the way judges do when they want to get a sense of who they're dealing with. His gaze swept past Gaia's table, past Elliot's position, and landed on me in the gallery. For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then I saw the recognition hit him like a physical blow. His eyes widened slightly, his hand froze halfway to his water glass, and his carefully maintained judicial composure cracked just enough for me to see the shock underneath. "Chief Justice Joyce Ann," he said, his voice carrying a note of stunned disbelief that cut through the courtroom's quiet murmur. "What are you doing here?" The silence that followed was absolute. Every head in the courtroom turned toward me, and I could feel the weight of their stares like a physical pressure against my chest. Gaia's perfectly lipsticked mouth fell open in a way that would have been comical if the moment hadn't been so charged with electricity. Helena's face went through a series of expressions so quickly, it was like watching someone flip through television channels. Confusion, then realization, then something approaching terror. "Mr." Peterson's pen clattered to the table as his hand went limp, but it was Elliot's reaction that hurt the most. My son stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not just surprise, but something deeper. Recognition mixed with shame, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years, and didn't like what that revelation said about him. "Your Honor," I said quietly, rising from my seat with the dignity I had learned to carry through decades of presiding over my own courtroom. "I'm here as Elliot Morrison's mother. This is a family matter." "Ah!" The ripple effect of my words was immediate and devastating. I watched as Gaia turned to stare at Helena, her face pale beneath her expensive makeup. Helena was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Mr. Peterson was frantically shuffling through papers as if he could find some way to make this moment disappear. Judge Harrison set down his papers completely, removing his glasses to clean them with deliberate slowness, a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time to process unexpected information. "Chief Justice Morrison," he said, using my formal title with the kind of respect that had been absent from this room until 30 seconds ago. I had no idea you were connected to this case. This is highly unusual. I imagine it is, I replied, my voice steady despite the chaos I could feel building around me. I apologize for any confusion, Your Honor. I'm here simply as a concerned mother. But even as I said the words, I could see that the damage was already done. The carefully constructed narrative that Gaia and her family had built, the story of Elliot's embarrassing, insignificant mother who was beneath their notice, was crumbling in real time. Gaia finally found her voice, though it came out higher than usual. Your Honor, I don't understand. What does my mother-in-law's profession have to do with our divorce proceedings? The way she said profession made it clear she still didn't fully grasp what was happening. She was treating this like some minor complication, a bureaucratic hiccup that could be smoothed over with the right words. Judge Harrison looked at her with the kind of patience reserved for people who are about to receive very unwelcome news. Mrs. Morrison, he said to Gaia, Chief Justice Joyce Ann Morrison served on the state Supreme Court for 22 years. She was the Chief Justice for the final 8 years of her tenure before retiring 3 years ago. She is one of the most respected jurists in the state's history. The color drained from Gaia's face so completely I thought she might faint. Helena made a small choking sound, as if someone had just punched her in the stomach. Mr. Peterson was now openly panicking, his eyes darting between his papers and me like he was looking for an escape route. But the moment that would stay with me forever was watching Elliot's face as the full weight of what his wife and her family had done settled over him. The casual dismissals, the cruel comments, the systematic humiliation of someone they had assumed was powerless to respond, someone they had treated like an embarrassing relative to be hidden away, someone who had spent more than 2 decades interpreting and upholding the very laws they were now subject to. Elliot, Judge Harrison continued, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when addressing serious matters, did you know your mother's professional background when you filed these proceedings? My son's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. No, Your Honor. That is, we don't really discuss. He trailed off, seemingly unable to finish the sentence without incriminating himself further. The truth was stark and painful. Elliot knew so little about my life, had been so thoroughly convinced by his wife that I was irrelevant, that he hadn't even known what I did for a living. The woman who had raised him, who had worked nights and weekends to put him through college, who had sacrificed her own comfort to ensure his success. He knew nothing about her career, her accomplishments, her place in the world. Gaia was whispering frantically to her mother, who was shaking her head in small, sharp movements. I caught fragments of their conversation. How were we supposed to know? And this changes everything. And we need to reconsider. But it was too late for reconsideration. The mask had slipped, and everyone in that courtroom had seen exactly who they really were. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat nervously. Your Honor, if I may, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about Mrs. Morrison's background. Perhaps we could take a brief recess to— No, Judge Harrison said firmly. We'll continue as scheduled. However, I think it's important that all parties understand the gravity of these proceedings and conduct themselves accordingly. His meaning was clear. The games were over. The casual cruelty, the dismissive comments, the assumption that they could treat me however they pleased because I was powerless, all of that ended now. But even as I felt a surge of vindication, I knew this was only the beginning. Because what they didn't know yet, what none of them had even begun to suspect, was that my connection to their family ran much deeper than anyone imagined. 23 years ago, when I was still a circuit court judge, I had presided over a case that would change everything. A case involving fraud, corruption, and a businessman who thought his wealth and connections made him untouchable. A businessman named Harold Westbrook, Helena's father, Gaia's grandfather, the man whose criminal conviction had been the foundation of my early reputation as a judge who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or influenced. As I watched Gaia and her family struggle to process this new reality, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice, delayed though it might be, was finally about to be served. Judge Harrison was organizing his papers again, preparing to move forward with the proceedings. But I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the same way I had seen them turn in my own courtroom when a case suddenly became much more complicated than it had appeared. "Before we proceed," he said carefully, "I want to make sure that all parties are comfortable with me continuing to preside over this matter, given the connections involved." He was giving them a chance to object, to request a different judge. It was the proper procedure, and I respected him for following it even though I knew what the answer would be. They couldn't object without admitting they had planned to treat me as less than human, and they couldn't request a new judge without explaining why. They were trapped, and they were only beginning to understand how completely. "No objections, Your Honor," Mr. Peterson said quietly, though his voice suggested he very much wanted to object to everything that was happening. Elliot's lawyer nodded as well, though I could see him reconsidering everything he thought he knew about this case. "Very well," Judge Harrison said. "Let's proceed." But as he opened the first file, I caught him glancing at me one more time, and I saw something in his expression that made my pulse quicken, a look of curiosity mixed with what might have been concern. He was wondering the same thing I had been wondering for years. What other secrets would come to light before this was over? During the lunch recess, I sat alone in my car in the courthouse parking lot, watching through the windshield as Gaia's family huddled together near their black Mercedes, their animated gestures betraying the panic they were trying to hide. Helena was on her phone, pacing back and forth while Gaia and Mr. Peterson engaged in what looked like an increasingly heated discussion. They were scrambling, trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that had spiraled completely out of their control. But what they didn't know was that it was about to get much worse. My phone buzzed with a text from an old colleague. "Saw the news about you being at the Morrison divorce. Harold Westbrook's granddaughter? This should be interesting." The news traveled fast in legal circles. By now, half the lawyers in the state probably knew that Chief Justice Morrison was involved in a family court case involving the Westbrook family. The irony would not be lost on anyone who remembered the trial that had defined my early career. I closed my eyes and let myself remember that sweltering August day 23 years ago when Harold Westbrook had strutted into my courtroom like he owned it. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, to buying his solutions, to making problems disappear with the right combination of money and intimidation. The charges against him were serious: fraud, tax evasion, and bribery. He had been systematically cheating his business partners and employees for years, hiding assets, falsifying documents, and paying off officials to look the other way. The evidence was overwhelming, but Harold Westbrook had one thing going for him. He had never met a judge he couldn't influence. He hadn't met me yet. I remembered his lawyer's opening strategy, the casual mention of donations to judicial campaigns, the subtle hints about how understanding Mr. Westbrook could be toward judges who saw the complexities of business law. I remembered the expensive gifts that arrived at my chambers, the invitations to exclusive events, the offers of consulting opportunities for after my term ended. And I remembered the moment when Harold Westbrook himself approached me in the courthouse hallway, his voice smooth as silk as he explained how much easier everyone's life would be if certain evidence was ruled inadmissible. "Judge Morrison," he had said, his smile never wavering, "I think you'll find that some flexibility in your interpretation of the law could be very beneficial for everyone involved, including your own future prospects." That was his mistake. He had assumed that because I was young, because I was relatively new to the bench, because I came from modest circumstances, I could be bought like every other obstacle in his path. He learned otherwise. I had not only refused his bribes, I had made sure every attempt was documented and reported. When his conviction came down, it was airtight. Harold Westbrook was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $8 million to his victims. The case had made my reputation, but it had also made me an enemy. Harold's family had never forgiven me for destroying their patriarch and their fortune. They had threatened appeals, filed complaints against me, and spent years trying to find ways to undermine my career. They had failed, but they had never stopped hating me. And now, through the cruelest twist of fate, Harold Westbrook's granddaughter had married my son. The afternoon session began with a new tension in the air. Word had clearly spread during the break, because the gallery was fuller than it had been that morning, and I recognized several faces from the legal community who had come to witness what promised to be an extraordinary case. Judge Harrison called the court to order, and Mr. Peterson rose to present Gaia's opening statement, but I could see the uncertainty in his movements, the way he kept glancing at me as if expecting some kind of legal ambush. "Your Honor," he began, his voice less confident than it had been that morning, "my client seeks a fair and equitable division of marital assets, as well as appropriate support arrangements for herself and the minor children involved." It was a standard opening, but I noticed what he didn't say. Gone were the references to harassment from Elliot's family. Gone were the implications that I had somehow undermined their marriage. Mr. Peterson was clearly trying to steer the case into safer waters, but Gaia wasn't as smart as her lawyer. "Your Honor," she said, rising from her seat despite Mr. Peterson's restraining hand on her arm. "I want to make something clear. The issues in our marriage weren't just between Elliot and me. There were outside influences that consistently undermined our relationship. She was still trying to play the victim, still trying to paint me as the problem. The audacity was breathtaking." Judge Harrison looked at her with barely concealed impatience. "Mrs. Morrison, please allow your attorney to speak for you." But Gaia was in full performance mode now, the tears coming on cue as she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but this is important. Elliot's mother never accepted me. Never accepted our marriage. She constantly tried to turn him against me, to make him choose between his wife and his family of origin. The lie was so brazen, so complete, that I felt my own composure crack for the first time that day. I had done the exact opposite. I had stepped back, given them space, accepted every slight and exclusion without complaint. I had made myself smaller and smaller until I practically disappeared from Elliot's life entirely. And she was claiming that I had been manipulative and interfering. Elliot's lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen, stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Mrs. Morrison's statements are not relevant to the financial matters before the court today." "Sustained," Judge Harrison said, but his eyes remained fixed on Gaia. "Mrs. Morrison, please confine your remarks to the issues at hand." But the damage was done. Gaia had publicly accused me of sabotaging her marriage, of being a manipulative mother-in-law who couldn't let go. In front of a room full of legal professionals who knew exactly who I was and what I stood for. That's when I made my decision. I rose from my seat in the gallery, and the room fell silent. Every eye was on me as I walked slowly toward the rail that separated the gallery from the court proper. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench, "I request permission to address the court." Judge Harrison hesitated. "Chief Justice Morrison, this is highly irregular. You're not a party to these proceedings." "No, Your Honor, I'm not. But I have been directly accused of interfering in this marriage, of manipulating my son, of being the cause of problems between the parties. I believe I have the right to respond to those accusations." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Gaia had gone pale again, and Helena looked like she wanted to disappear into her seat. Mr. Peterson was frantically shuffling papers, probably looking for some procedural objection that could stop what was about to happen. "Very well," Judge Harrison said after a long pause. "You may address the court, but please keep your remarks brief and relevant." I stepped forward, and 23 years of judicial experience took over. My voice was calm, measured, and utterly certain. "Your Honor, I want to address Mrs. Morrison's accusations directly. She claims that I interfered in her marriage, that I tried to turn my son against her, that I was a disruptive influence in their relationship." I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. The truth is exactly the opposite. For 7 years, I have watched my daughter-in-law systematically exclude me from my son's life. I have been uninvited from family gatherings, excluded from major milestones, and treated as an embarrassment to be hidden away. I have received exactly 3 phone calls from my son in the past 2 years, and I have not seen my grandchildren in over 18 months. The words hung in the air like accusations, each one a small revelation of the cruelty that had been hiding behind Gaia's perfect facade. But that's not the most important thing I need to say, I continued. What Mrs. Morrison and her family don't know is that our connection goes back much further than this marriage. Helena's sharp intake of breath told me she was beginning to understand where this was heading. 23 years ago, I presided over the criminal trial of Harold Westbrook, Mrs. Morrison's grandfather. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The explosion of whispers from the gallery was immediate. Gaia's face went from pale to ashen, and Helena actually swayed in her seat. Mr. Peterson dropped his pen again, and this time he didn't bother to pick it up. "Your Honor," I said, my voice rising slightly above the murmur. "Harold Westbrook spent considerable time and money trying to bribe me, trying to influence my decision in his case. When that failed, his family spent years trying to destroy my career in retaliation." Judge Harrison was staring at me with an expression of complete disbelief. "Chief Justice Morrison, are you saying that Mrs. Morrison's family has a history of attempting to corrupt judicial proceedings?" "I'm saying that the Westbrook family has never accepted that there are people who cannot be bought, intimidated, or manipulated. And I'm saying that Mrs. Morrison's treatment of me becomes much more understandable when viewed in that context." The courtroom erupted in noise. Reporters were frantically taking notes, lawyers were whispering to each other, and Gaia was having what appeared to be a panic attack. But through it all, I kept my eyes on Elliot. My son was staring at me with an expression of dawning horror, finally understanding not just who I was, but what his wife's family had done to me, what he had allowed them to do. The woman he had dismissed as an embarrassing burden was the same judge who had put his wife's grandfather in prison. The mother he had pushed away to please his new family was someone the Westbrooks had been plotting against for more than 2 decades, and he had handed me over to them without even knowing it. Judge Harrison was calling for order, but the chaos in the courtroom was just beginning. Because as devastating as these revelations were, I knew there was still more to come. The Westbrook family's crimes hadn't ended with Harold's conviction, and Gaia's manipulation of Elliot hadn't been a crime of passion or desperation. It had been revenge. Carefully planned, meticulously executed revenge against the woman who had destroyed their patriarch. And now, they were about to learn what happened when you declared war on someone who had spent her entire career fighting for justice. The courtroom was in chaos for nearly 10 minutes before Judge Harrison managed to restore order. During those 10 minutes, I watched 23 years of suppressed anger and calculation crystallize into something cold and sharp in my chest. The Westbrook family had played a long game against me, using my own son as their weapon. Now it was my turn. "Court will recess for 1 hour, Judge Harrison announced, his voice cutting through the remaining murmur. "When we reconvene, I expect all parties to be prepared to proceed in an orderly fashion." As the gallery began to empty, I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap while chaos swirled around me. Gaia was in heated conversation with Mr. Peterson, her voice high and strained though I couldn't make out the words. Helena had her phone pressed to her ear, presumably calling someone who might be able to salvage this disaster, but it was Elliot who approached me first. "Mom," he said quietly, sliding into the bench beside me. For the first time in years, he looked like the little boy who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms. "Is it true? About Gaia's grandfather?" I turned to study my son's face, seeing the confusion and dawning horror in his eyes. "Yes, Elliot. Every word. But she never told me. She never said anything about knowing who you were." I felt a bitter smile tug at my lips. Oh, she knew exactly who I was. They all did. Elliot's face crumpled slightly. "How long have you known? About the connection? I suspected from the moment you brought her home and told me her last name. I was certain when I met her grandmother at your engagement party." I paused, letting him absorb this. Helena has her grandfather's eyes, and his talent for manipulation. "My God," Elliot whispered. "All this time she's been using you to hurt me?" "Yes." The words came out harder than I intended, but I was done protecting his feelings. Every exclusion, every humiliation, Every time you chose her family over me, it was all part of their revenge. Elliot buried his face in his hands. I'm so sorry, Mom. I had no idea. You had no idea because you never bothered to ask, I said quietly. You never asked about my career, my life, my accomplishments. You were so eager to please your new family that you erased me completely. The truth hung between us like a blade. Elliot looked up at me with tears in his eyes, but before he could respond, Mr. Peterson appeared at our table. Chief Justice Morrison, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I wonder if I might have a word with you privately. I stood, smoothing my cardigan. Of course. He led me to a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, closing the door behind us. When he turned to face me, I could see the defeat already settling in his shoulders. You know why I'm here, he said. I assume you're going to ask me to show mercy to your client. He winced. Mrs. Morrison. Gaia. She's made some serious mistakes, but she's also a mother. She has 2 young children who don't deserve to suffer for their mother's poor judgment. I settled into one of the conference room chairs, studying the man across from me. He was competent enough, but he had no idea what he was really dealing with. Mr. Peterson, I said calmly, let me explain something to you. Your client didn't make poor judgment calls. She orchestrated a 7-year campaign of psychological warfare against me, using my own son as her primary weapon. She isolated me from my family, turned my grandchildren against me, and made me doubt my own worth as a mother and human being. He shifted uncomfortably. Chief Justice Morrison, I understand you're upset. I'm not upset, Mr. Peterson. I'm calculating. I leaned forward slightly. You see, during my years on the bench, I learned something very important about people like the Westbrook family. They never stop. They never learn. They simply get more careful about hiding their crimes. The color drained from his face. What are you saying? I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick manila folder I had been carrying since that morning. I had hoped I wouldn't need it, but Gaia's performance in court had made the decision for me. I'm saying that your client has been very busy during her marriage to my son. Busy hiding assets, falsifying financial documents, and systematically looting Elliot's business accounts. Mr. Peterson's mouth fell open. That's a very serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. I opened the folder and spread several documents across the conference table. Bank records, transfer receipts, forged signatures. Your client has stolen approximately $430,000 from my son's business over the past 3 years. He stared at the papers in horror. Where did you get these? I may be retired, Mr. Peterson, but I still have friends in law enforcement. Friends who were very interested to learn that Harold Westbrook's granddaughter might be following in his footsteps. I gathered the papers back into the folder. Of course, Elliot doesn't know about any of this yet. He's been so distracted by the divorce proceedings that he hasn't had time to thoroughly audit his business accounts. You can't prove she knew about your connection to her grandfather, he said desperately. I smiled, and I saw him shiver slightly at the coldness in it. Can I? I pulled out my phone and played a voice recording. Gaia's voice filled the small room, crystal clear and utterly damning. Mother, you don't understand. This isn't just about the money. This is about making that bitch pay for what she did to grandfather. Elliot is so pathetic, so desperate for approval. He'll do anything I ask. I've got him cutting his mother out completely, and she doesn't even know why. Helena's voice responded, Darling, you're being too obvious. If she figures out who we are, she won't. She's too proud to admit she doesn't recognize us. And even if she does, what can she do? Elliot chose me. He chose our family. She's already lost. The recording continued for another 30 seconds, detailing their plan to isolate me completely before moving on to phase 2, whatever that meant. Mr. Peterson listened with growing horror, his face getting paler with each word. When was this recorded? He whispered. 2 years ago, at your client's birthday party. Elliot had asked me to come, but Gaia uninvited me at the last minute. She didn't know I was still in the parking lot when she and her mother went outside to celebrate their success. I turned off the recording and put my phone away. So you see, Mr. Peterson, This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or unfortunate family dynamics. This was a deliberate, calculated campaign of revenge, and now it's my turn. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the table. When he finally looked up, his voice was barely audible. "What do you want?" "I want your client to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters to her. I want her to experience the same isolation, the same humiliation, the same complete destruction of her support system that she inflicted on me." "You're talking about destroying her life." "I'm talking about justice," I corrected. "And I'm talking about protecting my son and grandchildren from a woman who sees them as nothing more than tools for revenge." Mr. Peterson was quiet for several minutes, presumably weighing his options. Finally, he sighed heavily. "What are your terms?" I opened the folder again and slid a prepared document across the table. "Your client will receive exactly what she's entitled to under state law, which, given the evidence of financial fraud, amounts to very little. She will agree to joint custody with Elliot as the primary guardian. She will return every penny she stole from Elliot's business accounts. And she will sign a statement admitting to her campaign against me." He read through the document, his expression growing grimmer with each paragraph. "She'll never agree to this. Then she'll face criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. And I'll make sure every detail of her family's history becomes public record." I leaned back in my chair. "Mr. Peterson, your client made one crucial mistake. She assumed that because she had successfully isolated me from my son, I was powerless. She forgot that I spent 22 years building relationships with every prosecutor, every judge, and every law enforcement official in this state. The threat hung in the air between us, unspoken, but crystal clear. Gaia could accept my terms, or she could face the full weight of the legal system that I had helped shape for more than 2 decades. "I'll need to discuss this with my client," he said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need." I stood and moved toward the door. "But Mr. Peterson, the offer expires when court reconvenes. After that, I stop being reasonable." As I reached for the door handle, he called out behind me. "Chief Justice Morrison? For what it's worth, I'm sorry. What they did to you, it was unconscionable." I turned back to him, and for a moment I let him see past the composed facade to the pain underneath. "Mr. Peterson, they didn't just hurt me. They stole 7 years of my relationship with my son. They kept me away from my grandchildren. They made me question everything I believed about myself as a mother." I paused, feeling the weight of all those lost years. "But most importantly, they made the mistake of thinking that justice delayed meant justice denied. They're about to learn otherwise." When I returned to the courtroom, I could see that word of our conversation had already reached Gaia and her family. Helena was pacing again, her phone calls becoming increasingly frantic. Gaia sat slumped in her chair, the fight seemingly gone out of her. Elliot was waiting for me in the gallery, his face etched with a pain I recognized. It was the same expression I had worn for 7 years, the look of someone who finally understood how completely they had been manipulated. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. I sat down beside him, my son who I had fought so hard to protect and lost so completely. "No," I said softly, "but it's about to be." When court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed completely. The morning's chaos had settled into something heavier, more final. Gaia sat beside her lawyer like a woman attending her own funeral. Her perfect composure finally cracked beyond repair. Helena was notably absent. She had left during the recess, presumably to begin damage control for what was coming. Mr. Peterson rose slowly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Your Honor, my client would like to make a statement to the court." Judge Harrison nodded, though I could see the wariness in his eyes. "Very well, Mrs. Morrison, you may proceed." Gaia stood on unsteady legs, her hands trembling as she gripped a piece of paper. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, I need to make some corrections to my earlier statements." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was not truthful about my relationship with my mother-in-law. Chief Justice Morrison never interfered in my marriage. She never tried to manipulate my husband or turn him against me." The words seemed to physically pain her, each admission extracting a visible cost, but she continued, reading from what was clearly a prepared statement. In fact, it was I who systematically excluded her from our family. I who manipulated my husband into choosing between his wife and his mother. I who used my children as weapons to keep her away. Her voice broke slightly. I did these things not because of any wrongdoing on her part, but because of a family grudge that had nothing to do with Elliot or our marriage. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys as she absorbed what she was hearing. Furthermore, Gaia continued, her voice getting stronger as if confessing was somehow liberating her, I have been systematically stealing money from my husband's business accounts. Over the past 3 years, I have taken approximately $430,000 without his knowledge or consent. A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Elliot's face went white, and I saw his hands clench into fists on his lap. I am prepared to make full restitution and to accept whatever legal consequences may result from my actions. Gaia folded the paper and looked directly at me for the first time since the morning's revelations. Chief Justice Morrison, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now what I took from you, and I'm sorry. She sat down heavily, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Mrs. Morrison, do you understand that your statement constitutes an admission of criminal conduct? Yes, Your Honor. And you're making this statement voluntarily, with full knowledge of the potential consequences? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Harrison looked at the documents Mr. Peterson had submitted during the recess. Based on these admissions and the evidence presented, the court finds that the marital assets should be divided as follows. Mr. Elliot Morrison will retain full ownership of his business and all associated accounts. Mrs. Morrison will retain her personal belongings and her vehicle. The family home will be sold, with the proceeds used first to repay the stolen business funds and any remainder to be split equally. It was a devastating financial blow for Gaia, but given her admissions, it was also remarkably lenient. Judge Harrison continued with the custody arrangements, joint custody with Elliot as primary guardian, exactly as I had demanded. As the proceedings concluded and the courtroom began to empty, I remained seated, watching as Gaia gathered her things with the mechanical movements of someone in shock. Mr. Peterson was already on his phone, presumably arranging for criminal defense counsel. Elliot approached me hesitantly. Mom, I need to ask you something. I looked up at my son, seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The confident businessman was gone, replaced by a lost man who was just beginning to understand the scope of his betrayal, both of me and of himself. The recording, he said quietly. How long have you known? About what she was doing? I've suspected for a while. I've known for certain for about 6 months. His face crumpled. 6 months? Mom, why didn't you tell me? I stood slowly, my joints protesting after the long day. Because you wouldn't have believed me, Elliot. You had to see it for yourself. The truth of that statement hung between us. Even 6 months ago, even knowing what I knew, if I had tried to warn him about Gaia, he would have seen it as more interference from his embarrassing mother. I lost 7 years with you, I said softly. 7 years of watching my grandchildren grow up through other people's social media posts. 7 years of wondering what I had done wrong as a mother to make you ashamed of me. Elliot's tears came then, silent and devastating. I was never ashamed of you. I was just. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to belong to something that felt successful and important. And what I had given you, a mother who worked nights to put you through college, who sacrificed everything to make sure you had opportunities, that wasn't enough? He shook his head, unable to speak. I reached out and touched his cheek, the first physical contact we'd had in over a year. Elliot, I understand why you made the choices you did. But understanding doesn't erase the consequences. What does that mean? For us? I considered the question carefully. The honest answer was that I didn't know. 7 years of systematic rejection and humiliation couldn't be undone with a single moment of recognition, no matter how dramatic. It means we start over, I said finally. Slowly, carefully, with honesty this time. I'd like that. he whispered. So would I. As we left the courthouse together, I caught sight of Gaia standing alone by her car, her family notably absent now that she was no longer useful to their cause. For a moment, I felt something approaching pity. She had been raised by people who saw relationships as transactions, love as a commodity to be traded for advantage. In many ways, she was as much a victim of the Westbrook family pathology as I was. But pity didn't mean forgiveness, and understanding didn't erase accountability. 3 months later, I was in my kitchen making dinner when I heard the front door open. Elliot had started coming by twice a week, bringing my grandchildren for visits that were slowly rebuilding what had been destroyed. Grandma Joyce Ann. My 5-year-old grandson Marcus called out, racing into the kitchen with the kind of enthusiasm that made my heart ache with how much I had missed. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, scooping him up for a hug. "How was school?" As Marcus chattered about his day, Elliot appeared in the doorway, 8-year-old Emma hanging shyly behind him. She was still warming up to me, still processing the dramatic changes in her family structure, but she was trying. "Something smells good," Elliot said, attempting normalcy. "Pot roast," I replied. "Your favorite." I remember. These dinners were still awkward sometimes, full of careful conversations and unspoken apologies. But they were real in a way that nothing had been for 7 years. Elliot was learning to see me not as an embarrassment to be managed, but as his mother. I was learning to trust that his presence in my life wasn't temporary, wasn't dependent on pleasing the right people or fitting into the right social circles. Gaia had pled guilty to embezzlement and received 2 years of probation along with restitution requirements. She was working as a receptionist at a medical office, living in a small apartment, and struggling to rebuild any kind of relationship with her children. Helena had suffered a stroke shortly after the trial. The stress of watching her family's carefully constructed world collapse had apparently been too much. The Westbrook family's reign of influence was over, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the simple revelation of who they really were. As I watched Marcus show Emma how to help set the table, I realized that my victory wasn't in Gaia's downfall or the family's humiliation. It was in this moment, in my grandson's laughter, in my granddaughter's shy smile, in my son's presence at my table. For 23 years, I had carried the weight of Harold Westbrook's threats and his family's hatred. I had absorbed their revenge plot, their systematic cruelty, their attempt to erase me from my own son's life. I had been patient when I wanted to fight, silent when I wanted to scream, understanding when I wanted justice. But in the end, the truth had been enough. Not dramatic courtroom confrontations or public humiliation, but simply allowing people to see clearly what had been hidden. Elliot helped the children wash their hands while I finished preparing the meal we had been sharing for 34 years, with a 7-year interruption that felt like a lifetime. As we sat down together, Marcus reached for my hand to say grace, a tradition I had maintained alone for so long. "Thank you for bringing our family back together," Elliot said quietly as the children began eating. I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of forgiveness, both given and received. "We were never apart," I said. "We were just waiting for the right moment to find each other again." Outside, the sun was setting over the city where I had spent my career fighting for justice, where I had raised my son, where I had learned that sometimes the most powerful victories are the quietest ones. In my kitchen, surrounded by the family that had been stolen from me and then returned, I finally understood what true justice looked like. Not revenge, not public vindication, but simply the restoration of what had always belonged together. The long game was over. Love had won. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.